Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to welcome you to our second seminar series of this semester. Our speaker tonight is Ms. Elena Habersky. Elena is a 2018 graduate of AUC's Center for Migration Refugee Studies postgraduate program. Prior to receiving her MA degree, Elena worked for various refugee and migration organizations in Cairo and Amman, including the International Organization for Migration, IOM, Collateral Repair Project, and the Jesuit Refugee Services. She is a current Haas Lab post-MA fellow at AUC, where her research will expand towards speaking with other African migrant communities in both Cairo and Kampala, Uganda. And as you can see, the title of her talk tonight is Unpacking the Stranger, Listening to the Lives of Darfuris in Amman and Cairo. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everyone hear me? Great. So thank you all for coming. As Sarah said, my name is Elena. I'm a recent graduate of CMRS. And thank you so much for coming to my lecture. So as you can see, the title of my lecture is Unpacking the Stranger, Listening to the Lives of Darfuris in Amman and Cairo. But if you've been to previous CMRS lectures, I kind of wanted to do it a little bit differently and make it like a story. My research and my friendship with my Darfuri friends is mainly me listening for hours and just hearing their stories. So I thought that I would kind of do that for you and become a storyteller. So hopefully you find this insightful and you learn, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. So like any good story, I'm not going to start from the beginning. I'm actually going to start from kind of in the middle. And for those of you who are thinking, wow, Elena, you picked your birthday. Well, yes, I do love my birthday, but there is a particular reason why I picked this date. So December 16th, 2015. I woke up, I was very excited. It was my 25th birthday, and I was looking forward to hanging out with friends and going out to dinner and just celebrating. Instead, I woke up to a text message from one of my friends that a lot of my former students and Darfuri friends were put onto buses at around 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning in Amman, and were headed for the Queen Alia International Airport to be deported back to Khartoum. So that was not how I wanted to start off my birthday, obviously. And from there, unfortunately, the news just kept getting worse and worse. After a few hours, I started receiving text messages from my friends about what was happening. They were on buses, they weren't getting adequate food and water, their hands were visibly zip-tied, they weren't allowed to move, and the news was kind of all over the place. There was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of miscommunication. UNHCR was saying they didn't have anything to do with it. Other organizations were blaming others, but no one had access to these people. Really, the only outside access that they had were to people like me, normal people who just knew them, had their phone numbers, and they were able to transmit communication with just normal, everyday people. So December 16th, 2015. This is where my interest on this topic begins, where the story, I guess, for me begins. This fateful day, which changed the lives of hundreds of people, not only in Cairo, but now in Sudan, in Jordan, in Europe, and across the world. So we will go from there. So fall 2013 was when I first moved to Jordan after I graduated from college, and I started volunteering at the Jesuit Refugee Services. It's an organization in Amman. They were offering English classes in the evening to refugees from all nationalities and all backgrounds. It had been something I had been interested in, both teaching and working with migrant and refugee communities. So I signed up to be a teacher. The classes were held in East Amman. For those of you who don't know, the capital city of Jordan, Amman, is kind of split into two separate areas, East and West Amman. East is less economically well off, where the West is a little more economically better. So When I first started teaching at JRS, I was honestly unaware of the scope of African refugees in Amman. I had expected to come and to meet Syrians and to meet Iraqis and to meet Palestinians, but I was very unaware that there were Darfuris or Somalis or any other African communities within the city. To me, this made sense. There was no historical ties or geographical borders, unlike Egypt or the rest of Africa. Now there's a bit of medical tourism in Jordan, so you do see a bit more Sudanese going, and this is growing slowly as an industry. But for me, I just didn't think that any African migrant populations would head to Jordan. I thought they would go to other countries within the continent. But the more I got to learn about my students, the more I taught them, they started to tell me about their situations in Darfur. Honestly, as an American, I had heard about Save Darfur and the Darfur movement, but I didn't really know what was happening or how it affected the people. So to hear firsthand the stories that my students were telling me was very, very powerful. Unfortunately, in fall 2014, the program that I was teaching in closed, and the Darfuri community especially lost a very important community space and center where they could share their stories and feel comfortable. So this was a huge loss to the community and for the people who were teaching them. So then we jump forward a bit, 2 years, November 16th to December 16th, 2015. And this is when I started connecting again with my Darfuri friends. After the English Center had closed, I kind of lost contact with a few of them. I was teaching in a different school. I didn't see them as often in my neighborhood, but then once November 16th came around, I started becoming more aware of their presence again. They started peacefully protesting outside of the UNHCR premises in Amman. For those of you who have any knowledge of the history of Cairo, a lot of people were comparing this to the protests in the early 2000s of the Sudanese community outside the UNHCR offices in Cairo. And they were protesting what they believed to be discrimination that was from UNHCR and other organizations compared to other refugee populations. So they believed that the Syrians and the Iraqis and pretty much the other Arab populations were receiving more assistance than they were, and that this was based mainly on discrimination, based on skin color and origin. They wrote very detailed letters to embassies, to news audiences, detailing what they wanted. They wanted an end to discrimination. They wanted their children to have access to education. They wanted better access to healthcare. They wanted cash assistance for food and rent. They wanted to be able to work. It is illegal to work. I mean, there are a few now visas for people to work in Jordan, but it is mainly illegal to work. But it's easier, say if you're Syrian or if you're Iraqi, to pass off as a Jordanian or a Palestinian than if you're obviously of African origin. So they saw this as a huge impediment to them gaining cash assistance and gaining the money to buy basic foodstuffs, pay for rent, pay their children's education costs. They also asked for a quicker RSD, refugee status determination, decisions, and also more resettlement options. So they believe that also the Syrians, because they were in the media more, because the Syrian conflict was in the media more, they were being resettled faster and with more opportunities to Canada, the US, and Europe, and they were not because of their origin. So this put them in an interesting situation, at least from what people told me, because they didn't really trust these large organizations, but they also wanted to gain visibility with these organizations as well. So they had to kind of toe this line, how do we get help? How do we get assistance? And what's the best way to do this? And after a few years, they decided, okay, we're going to peacefully protest out front of the UNHCR premises. And they did gain a bit of traction. There were some articles in local newspapers, nothing huge, nothing international, but the local news was picking up that these protests were happening. They had very colorful tents outside that were very visible. And there were hundreds of people protesting. There were individuals as well as families who were protesting. Sometimes apartments, they would have 20 men in them, for example, because they need to pay rents. They can't work. Some people can work. So you live 20 people to an apartment. That way maybe half of them work and can pay the rent, and then you switch. So just like for the protests as well, sometimes half of the apartment would go for a week, and then the next week the other half of the apartment would go, and they would take turns. This way, you know, people could work, people could buy food, make money, and then the other half of the apartment would go and have their place in the protests. And this is, again, when I started becoming closer friends with some of my former Darfuri students. And I started speaking with them about their lives and their memories of Darfur itself. So I want to share one story. My friend Amman, also all the names I'm using are not real to protect my interlocutors. And he was talking about 2003. And when he was talking to me in Arabic, he used numbers first off. So he would say something like 5, and then 7, and then 42. And I didn't know what the numbers meant at first, but he told me. 5 a.m. was the time that the tanks started to roll in to his village. And then 7 was the number of the tanks. And 42 was the number of friends he lost. So he was very methodical in the way he was telling his story. And he was very, very serious, almost no emotion. But I knew when he was telling me the story that what he was telling me was very important. And for them, this is where the story starts. And I didn't want to put it in my presentation in the beginning as a story because they're not my stories to tell, but they're very important. Because if I'm talking about the migratory experience of the Darfuri refugee and the fragmented journeys they have had, then really they start there when they had to flee from their villages. Many of them fled on foot. They ran in opposite directions, so a lot of families were torn apart. Some fled into the mountains near the border with Chad. Some fled near to Khartoum. You know, they ran in all different directions. And my other friend, Mohammed, for example, told me about losing his family. And he wasn't able to find them for 2 years until he was in an internally displaced persons camp. And he was able to contact the International Committee for the Red Crescent and Red Cross. And he was actually able to find his family because they had listed their names and they were able to find them. But if we're talking about fragmented journeys that aren't linear, that kind of go back and forth, they really start here at the beginning of the conflict for many of the Darfuris that I know. So for many of these individuals, they ended up in Khartoum. So they go from their villages in Darfur, they end up in IDP camps, and then they make their way to Khartoum to try and work odd jobs to gain any type of money. Again, this isn't everyone, but this is a lot of people that I talk to. And then from working menial jobs, either laying wires for telephone poles or doing construction work, they were able to save up enough money to bribe individuals to then take airplanes to Jordan. And the people who helped them told them, you know, what to wear, what to say, what to do when they arrived in the airport. And this is how they originally arrived to Jordan, which was one of the questions I had. Okay, there are no historical or geographical ties really between Jordan and Sudan. How do you end up in Sudan? So this is the first major question I had, and I found this out through storytelling. You know, how did you come here? Yes. Oh, sorry, from Jordan. Yes. And this was eventually used against them when Jordan was deporting them. They said that they came irregularly, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how a person enters the country, regularly or irregularly, if you have a well-founded fear of persecution. So then we come to December 18th, 2015. This is the day of the deportation, and this day I remember very well. I had really not slept at all that night. I was receiving messages from friends, live Facebook video chats, Facebook messages. The Darfuris who were in the buses were taken to a warehouse outside of the airport. And they were all put inside, and they were unsure kind of what was happening. Were they going to go back? Were they going to be deported? No one really knew. And then come around midnight, tear gas started to be pelted at them. And this is when I started getting the videos and the phone calls. And I could hear people chanting. I could hear people screaming. It was a night I will never forget. And then the following morning, they were put on airplanes. Their UNHCR papers were taken away from many of them. I had asked them, do you still have your UNHCR papers? They said no, they had taken them from us to try and prove to outside governments that they actually didn't enter the country legally. They weren't registered refugees, therefore what Jordan was doing was legal. And then for 2 days, I heard nothing. The night of December 18th, I went to a friend's apartment. Half of their apartment had been deported. They were scared to go outside. They were afraid that if they went outside, the Jordanian police would see them. They knew what was happening. They would round them up, and they would also deport them as well. So there was a lot of precarity. A lot of people didn't know what was going on. And I, with a few of my friends, we took food to the people in this apartment, and we just sat in silence, complete and total silence. And it was a silence that it could cut with a knife. And then one of my dear friends just started crying because his best friend, who was deported, had left his outfit for the next day on a hanger. And he just looked at it and said he was supposed to come back. Why isn't he here? And then he just started crying, and then I started crying. So this is a day I will never forget. And what I had learned 2 days later from a friend who was deported, he was actually able to message me, and this was the first contact that actually anyone had with anyone who was deported. It was December 20th. He just said that he was in Khartoum, and that all of the people who were deported were also in Khartoum, but not everyone was safe. People were going through interrogations. People fled from the airport after they left. They weren't sure if it was safe to go find their families or not, or their friends, or would they be followed. Friends said that when people asked them questions, they knew exactly who they were, where they went to school, who their family members were, if they were involved in any political organizations, where they lived in Amman, what they were doing in Amman. They just knew everything. So from this, they knew that it was not safe to stay in Sudan, and many of them knew that they had to flee. Based off of what happened to them in the past, obviously, through the genocide, but also what was happening to them now. So their fragmented journeys continued. And after this, because I knew I was moving to Cairo from Jordan, I knew that I had to listen to their stories and listen to them well. But I also had a lot of questions. How did these people, first off, come to Jordan? How did they assemble in their communities? How did their migratory experience affect this assemblage in their communities? How did their fragmented journeys affect what they were dealing with? And how is transnational migration into all of this? And I hope, again, from the stories that I'm about to tell, all of these answers will come to light. So August 2017, I headed back to Jordan, to Amman, because if I wanted to understand the stories, I had to start from where I first met these individuals. So I head back to Jordan. And for many of those in Jordan, these are more like halted migratory experiences, right? They go to Jordan and they have a dream. I'm going to go to the EU. I'm going to go to the US. I'm going to go to Canada. But it's halted. It's already fragmented because they're stuck in their minds. They're stuck in Jordan. So how do they assemble? How do they find each other? So this was my first question. How did you find each other? So one of my friends, Abdullah, said he literally just went downtown and he started asking around. Hey, do you know where any other Darfuris? Do you know where any other African migrants may be? And he said a lot of people did this. They know downtown is the meeting center, it's the cultural center, it's more the economic center. So they went downtown and they just said, hey, where are other people who can maybe be like me, who can support me, and who can help me? And through this, the Darfuri community has formed a tight-knit and well-organized community structure. Maybe they wouldn't have met in Darfur. You know, there is geographical differences, cultural differences, linguistic differences. But now, in this exile, they find each other through their commonality. And Amman is a very interesting city because, for me at least, it is a city of refugees. In the early 20th century, Circassians and Armenians first came to Amman, and then obviously Palestinians after 48, and then Iraqis and Syrians, but also Darfuris and Somalis. For the Darfuris that I knew, city life is very foreign to them, especially in Amman. They feel like the apartments are too close together. They don't really know how to navigate the city all the time because of what they perceive as their strangeness. They're worried about safety, but also they just feel it's not like their agrarian lives that they used to have. They used to go outside in the evening. They used to drink tea with other people. They always tell me this. You know, oh, Steza, if you come to Darfur in the evening, we all go outside, and the children play in the dirt, and we drink tea and coffee, and we talk. And they still do this. They still go over to each other's houses every evening, and they'll drink tea and coffee. And even in August, they will make me drink tea because they say it will help me cool down. But this is such a part of their history. So even though they are in city life and they're not 100% sure how to navigate it, they still try and navigate it the way they would have in Darfur. So as I'm in their apartments and I'm listening to them talk, I realize, thanks to the help of Lisa Malky, who is an anthropologist at Stanford, that these people who maybe in Darfur would have had no connections somehow are very close to one another. And I'm thinking, okay, how do they do this? I mean, you have maybe a bunch of Americans, a bunch of Belgians, a bunch of Ghanaians, and you put them in a foreign country. Will they have the same kind of closeness? And what brings this closeness? And what I have determined, at least in my own research, is using the theory of the mythico-history. And this is defined as a shared body of knowledge about the past among a particular community. So it's somewhere between myth and fact. So it's not necessarily lies, but it might not always be truthful. But why do people do this? Because it helps explain both their past struggles, but also their present difficulties. And for me, it explained how the Darfuris came together. And it gave them a sense of semblance and support that this might not have been the case in Darfur, again, due to the reasons I mentioned: economic, religious, geographical, educational. And I kind of put them in panels because when I talk to a lot of my friends and they tell me stories, I realize that a lot of the same topics come up over and over again. So if you'll allow me, I'll explain a bit the panels that I've seen that are similar across everyone I've talked to. So the first one is beginnings, or what I term beginnings. And it's important to them, to at least the Darfuris I spoke to, because they're very proud of their cultural and historical past, which was taken from them or attempted to have been taken from them. So I will be sitting and one of my friends will say, Elena, like, did you know that Darfur is where all human beings originated from? And I'll say, wasn't that Ethiopia? And they'll go, well, maybe, but I really think it was in Darfur, in Jebel Mara. We don't know because we can't go back there right now. But when we can go back there and learn our history, you will see that all Africans and all people originated from Darfur. And this was brought up by many people, as well as the Nubians, you know, the Nubian people. And they will say, oh, but you live in Egypt, you know the Nubians. They're a very ancient people, and the empire of Kush. These are our people. We are proud of these people. Another one is about the pyramids. You know, Egypt has pyramids, but Sudan has more pyramids. And no one goes to our pyramids, but our pyramids are better, and they're older. They'll also talk about ancient Egyptians being African, and why does Egypt now lie about its African history? They'll say, look at the mummies, look at their hair. This hair is African. Why are the Egyptians now saying that they're Arab? Is it only for money? So they are very proud of their African heritage and their past, and this was brought up by many people that I talked to. So this kind of forms the foundation for them, that they are African and they are very proud of being African. The second panel is culture. And this is what they try to pass on to future generations, but also for themselves in exile. So many people talked about the different tribal languages they speak, the dances they do at weddings, the songs that they sing, the foods that they cook, and the crafts that they make, like baskets, for example, that they make from dyes. Where a basket, maybe in Darfur, you put something in it. You hold something. But when you take that basket outside, when you're in Jordan, when you're in Egypt, that basket has more meaning. It has more cultural significance. And a lot of the people I talked to said that culture to them was closer to them than their own religion. Because for them, culture comes from God to a particular people. And you must cherish that culture that comes to you. I had one individual tell me, my religion is very important to me. But honestly, I can convert, I can change religions, but the culture that God gave me, I can never change that. That came to me, and it's special. And we need to carry on the Darfuri culture, both for ourselves, but also for our children, wherever we go. Because if we were all to leave Darfur, then we still need to carry that on for when one person can go back. So for them, this was the utmost importance. And also related to culture was treating people with respect. This was something I'd heard over and over and over, that in the Darfuri culture, you treat people with respect. And they were wondering why now it was hard for them to find that respect with other people. If they were to give respect to others, why did they not receive that back? And then Darfur itself. What is Darfur? I'm sure if you were in Darfur, and you ask people, people would tell you many different things. But when people are outside of their homeland and you ask them about Darfur, they talk about it like a mythical, magical paradise. It's a pure and happy place of bliss with perfect weather, abundant agricultural land, clean water and green mountains, fresh air, delicious fruits and vegetables, and shared community spaces. So they'll tell me, yes, this mango is delicious, but in Darfur, this mango would be even more delicious. The weather is not good here, but if you were in Darfur, the weather would be perfect. There are not very many agricultural products here, but if you were in Darfur, the agricultural products would be great. So they kind of put a very important aspect on what Darfur means to them. And then finally, one more thing that they talked about was Arabization. So I'd ask them, well, you're in Jordan, you're in Egypt, you speak Arabic, you practice Islam. But then they'd usually tell me, well, it was forced on us. This is not our language. We have our own language. We have our own names. And people don't take our language seriously. If we speak to them in Arabic, they still make fun of our accents. They still tell us that we don't speak like them. And I found this interesting because when together, most of my Darfuri friends speak Arabic because they're not all from the same tribes. So it's their common language. It also shows their educational background, that most of them were middle class probably in Darfur. But it is their language of communication, usually when they're together with people outside of their tribes. When they're in their own tribes, they usually speak their tribal languages. But through these panels of talking about Darfur, of talking about culture, Arabization, religion, and their beginnings, this is when I saw that the Darfuri in Amman becomes the Darfuri refugee in Amman. They form their own community, and they form their own assemblage. And this was going pretty well until the deportation. This was a very traumatic experience for everyone. So not only did the Darfuri refugee in Amman have to reassemble and rebuild a community structure, but now those deported also had to rebuild a community structure. So that takes me back to Cairo. So I went in Cairo to talk to my friends who were deported and to find out what they went through, why they came to Egypt, but also how did you reassemble this community structure? For me, African refugees and migrants in Egypt is historical. I mean, even between Sudan and Egypt, there are historical ties, and Egypt is a crossroads between Africa, the Middle East, and the European Union. While the history with Sudan might be long and complicated, it made more sense to me that there were geographical and historical ties. So when my friends were looking to leave Sudan, that they would go to Egypt. It made sense to me, logically. But how do you reassemble a community structure? Already you're on a fragmented journey, and then you have this very traumatic experience. So how do you then reassemble in community? And this is when, for me, the Darfuri refugee in Amman becomes the deported Darfuri refugee in Cairo. So now there are two distinct classes that I have. I have the Darfuri refugee in Amman, who is now reassembling after the deportation, but now I have a new class and a new category of people, the deported Darfuri in Cairo. So for these individuals, assemblage was pretty similar. They came in waves of people. First, a few people came, then more, then more, then more. And now there's over 100 people from Amman and Cairo, and they found each other. They were in contact with each other. And they went to the places in the city like Ardalua, for example, Giza, Ain Shams, where they knew that the rent was cheap, that they could live with each other, that there were maybe other African migrant communities there, and that's how they assembled within Cairo. They are still very well organized. They kept this from Jordan, but they also stay with one another. Now, the people that I talked to said, of course, we hang out with other African migrant populations. We're friends with other Africans. But deep, deep down, the people that we trust the most are the people that went through this traumatic experience with us in Jordan. So they have a WhatsApp group, for example, called The Deported. And they talk to one another every day. They support one another because they all went through the same experience. I mean, families were torn apart, apartments were torn apart, friendships were torn apart. And for them, they need to keep this identity that they went through this together, that they've gone through this fragmentation together. Because as one person told me, if you lose your identity, then you have nothing. And for them, this is very, very important. They have similar problems in Egypt like they had in Jordan with racism, with accessing services. For example, it's not the dream that they thought it would be. They thought, okay, we leave Jordan and we go somewhere else and maybe our situation will become better. But they have found that it's not really better, it's kind of the same. They say that the security situation might be more precarious. A lot of them are still unable to find work. But mainly, they talk about their friends and their relatives in Jordan and how much they miss them, which to me was very telling, right? You're in this community, you don't know these people before you form this community in Amman, and now you find yourself in an entirely new situation, but you still find yourself missing the people that you formed this first community with. Some of them still had dreams to go to Europe to be resettled. Some of them from Egypt went to Libya and have gone on to Europe. Some of them have unfortunately not made it as well. But they still have a dream of leaving Egypt to continue their journeys, because they still view this experience as fragmentation. And then finally, after I listened to these, my interlocutors and had these interviews, I had to make sense of it all. So that was last spring. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, I have all these stories. People have shared with me, I mean, hours. I had pages and pages of notes. But when I have these notes, I can't just transmit them and write them and say, okay, this is what people told me. I have to try and make sense of them. So I need to put academic theory to people's words. This was the toughest part for me, as I'm sure many of you might understand. But I wanted to give credence to their words and try and transmit their stories because their stories are important. A lot of the knowledge production, especially on migration and refugee studies, begins in the global north, but their experiences are very much in the global south. So I wanted to look at the people and look at my friends who didn't have access to the global north, and how do their experiences and their journeys affect them because they have to remain in the global south. I also looked overall at their migratory experiences. So migratory experiences affect everyone differently, including people who might have the same exact experience due to political, social, economic, and cultural reasons. A migratory experience is not straightforward and linear, especially for the Darfuris I spoke to. It is very fragmented, and the deportation caused a crack in the process, and it sent someone back to the beginning. So you have pre-flight, flight, resettlement, and then all of a sudden you're sent back to pre-flight because you're back in Sudan. So that's why I was asking them, you know, you're here, you're in Egypt, you went through these stages again. What are you thinking? But they still had dreams to go forward, to continue their migratory experience. And then, of course, the concept of the stranger. So who is the stranger? This was a word that was brought up many times by my interlocutors. So a stranger, as George Simmel, who's a sociologist, said, is someone who comes today and stays tomorrow. They don't come today and have dreams of staying, but they have to because of the situation, because of policies of containment, because of how the global north is reacting to people in the global south. A stranger is shown by their differences. Obviously, a lot of people brought up racism and the difference of skin color. So this is outward, and there are similarities, but through the similarities, people see the differences. But still, these people are enveloped by the community, and their community still plays a role. And this affects how they navigate the city and their relationships with others, whether they be the host community or other migrant communities. And it's important to remember that the host communities, both in Jordan and Egypt, also face precarity. They might have economic hardships, they might have other hardships. So then when you look at this holistically, you realize that there's more to this than what's on the surface. And then finally, assembling in community, which I kind of mentioned. So how do these people come together? How do they reassemble when something tragic happens? How do they assemble after something tragic happens? So I was very surprised, for example, when I was in Cairo, that my friends were like, yes, we hang out with each other, the deported. Like, that's what they called themselves. So they took a very well-established, tight-knit community and reassembled it in Cairo. And this very much surprised me. It's not what I was expecting. I thought, you know, they'll find other people, they'll make new friends. But very much to this day, they are still friends with one another. And that to me showed how important their assemblage was in Amman. And also there are other outside factors that play into this assemblage: immigration policies, as I said, deportation, relationship to the government, outside organizations like UNHCR, but also social media, mobile phones, the internet, architecture, city planning. All of these things play into a role on how people will assemble and reassemble. And obviously mythico-history, as I mentioned, makes this easier because you can come together and have a shared past that might not have been shared in your country of origin, but now makes it much easier. And then finally, fragmented journeys, which I had mentioned. So starting from Darfur, going to Jordan, or even going to an IDP camp to Khartoum, to Jordan, back to Khartoum, to Cairo, or even staying in Jordan and not going further into the resettlement process. These are fragmented journeys. They're becoming more common, unfortunately, because of the way the world is working right now, containment policies from the global north, immigration policies, and it's forcing people to make riskier decisions that they might not have made had this been the case. And this is both happening now in the global north and the global south. I mean, immigration policies from both sets of countries. But also access to communication makes these journeys easier and increases their number, because migrants choose countries that they might not have chosen before. They go places where they might not have been. They have access to information they might not have known in the past. So again, as I say, this was practiced not only by the global north, but also by the global south. And then today. So my hope was to at least transmit a bit. It's very hard when I have hours and hours of stories that I can tell to pick out what is the most important. But I hope from what I have told you, it gave you an insight into at least a community that is very important to me, and not always, it's kind of usually on the outside of the periphery of people's visions and view sites. And I hope that I was able to transmit their stories well and honestly. And if I were to say anything overall, or give you like a takeaway about what their assemblage and reassemblage means, it's that they're always playing a line between visibility and invisibility. So both in their communities that they form in Amman, but also in Cairo. So in certain instances, because they've gone through these fragmented journeys, because they do view themselves as the stranger, they feel invisible, right? To their host communities, to other people, to international organizations, to governments that they feel they're on the outside from because they're non-citizens, to the media, to social media, to anything. They feel invisible. But then, when they cross the line into visibility, they open themselves up to hardship and trauma and fragmented journeys. So they protest out front of UNHCR and they get deported. They walk down the street and someone tells them that they're chocolate, or they say something racist towards them. They go to an organization and they're told, I'm sorry, we only help Syrians. They go to the media and they say, well, your story is not that important, no one will care, and no one covers them. So through all of these factors, even to this day, I believe at least the Darfuri refugee in Amman and the deported Darfuri in Cairo plays this line between visibility and invisibility. So thank you for your time and attention, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Elena, for such a rich presentation. I've been trying to, if I may summarize, I know I wouldn't be able to do that accurately, but I think it's very important to look at new constructed identities. And also, I was particularly fascinated by the deported as a category on its own, and I would be happy to ask you further questions about that. But perhaps I have, if I may start with myself, I have a few questions, and then I'll give the floor for first round of questions. I was particularly interested to understand, I think you answered the how in terms of Amman, but not necessarily the why. I mean, as you said, clearly there are no historical relations, etc. So why particularly Amman, and whether social networks have played a role into this choice, which is an interesting choice. I'm also interested in how did the deported group work in between. So you talk about the trajectory or the fragmented journeys of Amman, deportation Khartoum, then Khartoum, Cairo. So within, do you have any stories about Khartoum, this in-between period, if any, and how it has affected particularly the choice of Cairo for the last station, or the current station? I'm also particularly interested whether you have any insights about, you mentioned relations with policies, authorities, organizations, but also Amman and Cairo are particularly different yet similar. I mean, you have a different landscape in Cairo than in Amman in terms of refugee service and the refugee regime. So whether this has affected, and also in the terms of the spatial kind of identity, like how did they navigate the city, whether it's Amman, Cairo, beyond racism, which I think is particularly very important, but also other navigations. And I would open the floor for the first round of questions.
I may ask you, how do you evaluate the current political situation in Sudan after so long years of the trouble of Darfur? if you are familiar of the current political situation within their home country, Sudan.
Okay. Shall I take?
Yeah.
Okay. Other? Yes, please.
I have a vague number. The population of Darfur is supposed to be 3 million, used to be in the past. So how many refugees are we talking about in Amman, and how many in Cairo? And also, now you're giving us a very new perspective, is that in Cairo we have South Sudanese and Darfur, and other, yeah, we see they don't seem to be all. They're not all African. They're different from different areas.
Okay, other questions for the first round? Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. Do you have intention to visit Darfur and to see the action in the ground, and also to give us your challenge there? And do you have any idea how to solve this problem in the future? And also the UNHCR, they don't have prevention policy before. Now in this period, do they have this prevention policy before the action or the crisis happen, like Rwanda genocide, and also the Kenyan also political situation under the new UNHCR president before solve this problem? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll give Elena the chance to answer, and then I'll come back for a second round of questions.
So why Amman? At least from the people that had originally come there was a community leader who was there. He had been there since the early 90s, and I think he influenced a few people to go. And then once people started going, it was kind of like a community network. People had heard, social media, people thought, okay, there are other refugees in Jordan. Jordan kind of puts itself out there in the international media as supporting refugees, so then more and more people started to come. As Khartoum, so I had a few friends talk to me about their experiences in Khartoum after they were deported. It only lasted a few days for most people because they were so scared before they came to Cairo. But like I said, a few of them were interrogated when they were talking to policemen. The policemen had files on them. They knew their educational background, where their families were from, what tribe they were from, their language. So I think that experience for a lot of people really told them, I need to get out. So I need to go from Khartoum to Cairo. And the question about Amman and Cairo, I feel for both of the groups that I'm talking about, it's still a city. It's not the agrarian life that they're used to. But I see a lot of similarities in the way they live their lives. Lots of people to one apartment to pay the rent. In the evening, they try and visit each other. This is a bit easier in Amman, which is smaller. They're able to walk in between. If you don't know, Amman is a lot of mountains, what they call mountains. They're mainly hills. But they're able to walk in between them, up and down the staircases, and they go visit their friends. There's always, they drink tea and they drink coffee and they watch either football matches or the WWE, or a lot of them practice their English, so they'll watch English movies at night. So I found these similarities in both of them. But obviously for them, Cairo is much bigger, and that's, just fact. The political crisis in Sudan, I didn't really focus that much on the politics. One thing I did focus on was climate change, actually, and how climate change affected the situation, the current situation in Darfur. I don't have an answer to the political crisis in Sudan. I'm aware that the situation still isn't great. I mean, I'm friends with many Darfuris on Facebook who post, political messages and videos of people still being persecuted. So I know the situation still isn't good. Obviously, people are not returning, and I think that's for a reason. But other than that, I really don't have any. I mean, I just, as the lecturer last month said, you know, it's hard. I'm an anthropologist, or I try and be an anthropologist. So to solve political crises are not my forte. For the Darfuris in Amman and Cairo, my sample size. So before they were deported, I believe there were like 5,000 Darfuris in Amman. So the number was not super large. It wasn't like the Syrians, it wasn't like the Iraqis, but it was bigger than most people thought. I believe there's no official number, unfortunately, but almost 800, between 700 and 800 people were deported. I only talked to 8 people in Jordan over a period of time, and I talked to them multiple times. So again, my sample size was pretty small, and my sample size in Cairo was exactly the same. In Amman, I was able to talk to more women because I had friends who were married, but in Cairo, my sample size was all men, unfortunately. But maybe in the future, I can get a more gendered perspective. I would love to visit Darfur. All of my friends always invite me, and they tell me, you know, when we go back, inshallah, we will see you in Darfur. I will need to practice my 4 language, which I am trying, but I can say Afi Kamua and Egendel and all of these things. So hopefully that can get me at least a bit into the community, and I know a few of the dances. And I can maybe cook a sida, so we'll see. I don't know if they'll let me in, but hopefully they will. As for the UNHCR prevention policy, I honestly don't know anything about that. But you know, hopefully now on the ground, I know people who actually are working in Darfur. So hopefully in the future, it can be a safe place to return to for everyone who is in exile.
Okay, there was a question here, I think.
Okay, hello. First, I would like to say thank you for your attention on Darfurians. Although not only the Darfurians are affected by the political situation in Sudan, but it's really, it's really a good thing to give attention to the Darfurians and to the African in Egypt or in Amman. My first question is, you said in your lectures that you have been in Uganda, as I heard. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about Uganda. What was your experience with Darfurians in Uganda?
So I'm actually going to Uganda in March.
Yeah.
And I will be hopefully meeting with Darfuris in March.
Yeah.
So maybe next year I can do another lecture. But I have not gone yet. I've gone to Uganda, but for a different reason. But
Yeah,
I will be going in March.
I thought you have also experienced the Darfurian life in Uganda too, so we can compare all.
Yes, that is my hope.
Yes. Also, I just wanted to ask the question to the person who talked about Sudan, and also he said there are other people not African. I didn't really get that. So if I heard him rightly, I want him to explain what he means by not African in Sudan. Yeah, other refugees who are not African that are from Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments or questions?
Hi, Elena. Thank you for your speech. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask you, as someone, you said this was a kind of a storytelling setting, and as the one who tells a story, the one who listens is also just as active in this dance. And so how were you read in this setting? And especially as someone who's really rooted in the global north, even if we are doing our research in the global south, how you were read, maybe certain expectations that were expected from you as someone from the US, etc. Thank you.
Any questions? Comments? Okay.
So I think to answer the expectation, I had to make it known before that I was really just listening to stories. and I wanted to transmit the stories, and I wanted to put the stories out there, but that there was really nothing I could do. Policy-wise or immigration-wise, I always had to make people know, and I'm not with an organization. I can't get you a visa to the US. I mean, most of the people at that point had known me for years. And they trusted me, and they don't trust a lot of people, so I take that trust very seriously, just because of the trauma that they have endured. So I very much listened. Really didn't ask that many questions. I'd ask maybe one question, and someone could talk for an hour, and I would just let them talk. And I felt that they needed, I mean, I needed that, but also they did too. It was very healing, I think, for both people. But expectations, yeah, I made it very known in the beginning that this is my background, this is where I come from. Maybe my voice can be used to help amplify and transmit your story, but other than that, I can't really do, you know, resettlements or RSD procedures or immigration policies. And I am aware that that is my background, or I hope I at least am aware that that is my background. And hopefully going forward, I can even become more aware of that situation.
Okay, I actually have two questions for you in terms of UNHCR. And the first one, I'm particularly interested in the UNHCR protest in Amman, and thankfully you mentioned the big one in Cairo. I was particularly interested what instigated this protest, because I know the one in Cairo, as far as I understand, was encouraged or was provoked by the fact of closing files of according to the peace agreement. But the one in Amman seems to be much more recent. So was there any tripping point that people felt that they had enough?
So I believe in the fall of 2015, I don't know if you remember, the photo of Aylan Kurdi came up in Turkey, and then the situation of Syrian refugees in Jordan was everywhere almost, or the situation of Syrians in general. And it had already been in the news, but I felt like in September and October it was everywhere, and people were asking for money for Syrians, maybe for Iraqis, but it was mainly like Syria was everywhere, and everyone was talking about Syria, and I think that kind of propelled at least the Darfuris I knew to say, wait, we're here too. And we've been here for longer, for some of them. They had been there longer than the Syrians. But why are the Syrians getting money and cash assistance and housing and education, and we're getting nothing? So I think that that was kind of the tipping point for a lot of people.
Okay. And I have a small follow-up question. Maybe I didn't follow this in your presentation. So these people had UNHCR cards, but they were charged with irregular entry?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions? Yes.
Presentation and lecture. I'm asking, although the crises are relevant to the Darfurian refugees around the world, we are speaking about the refugees, Darfurian who has been deported from Israel to Southern Sudan and Uganda. Do UNHCR tracing their protection still, or are there, because they will be interrogated and investigated later?
So I can't answer that right now, but hopefully when I go to Uganda in March, I will be able to. That's what I am hoping to look at, actually, to talk to Darfuris who are in Uganda who have been deported from Israel. Right now I'm doing background research on that, but hopefully in a few months I can answer that question more with a stronger foundation. But right now I unfortunately don't know.
Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments? Yes. No, just wait. Can you wait a second?
What is your future planning for this trouble, and how you solve it?
Well, trouble I don't know, but hopefully I'm hoping at least to get my work published. To reach a wider audience, especially about this topic, because it's not that focused on. Again, I'm trying to expand my research to other countries so I can do comparative case studies so people can see similarities and differences between different countries in the global south. And eventually, hopefully, to do a PhD and to do more in-depth research and to hopefully go to conferences and other lectures like this where I can make the experience of my friends more well-known.
Thank you.
The reason for deporting the Darfurians from Jordan to Sudan was irregular. I didn't get it. The irregular migration. They didn't
Right. So the
I
Jordanian
didn't
government.
get this one. Yeah.
Right. So the Jordanian government said that at least the people they deported had entered Jordan irregularly on visas to receive medical assistance. They overstayed their visas. They weren't registered with UNHCR. Therefore, they deported them.
Okay. Again, did they talk about like because you know Jordan and Egypt they are all Arab countries. Okay. So many Sudanese are speaking about the regimes. Both countries they have relations with the Sudanese government, and of course they always think about there are relationships with them, and they have agreed policies to bring people from here to there. So did they talk about such things?
My friends in Cairo actually did. They said that they trusted their friends back in Amman because they were all in the same situation. They all met each other. They all knew kind of that they came from the same place. But in Cairo, since there are more Darfuris and more Sudanese, they're not really sure who to trust. That's why they hang out with each other and they trust each other because they know they came from the same situation and the same journey. But other people, they say they could lie. They could say they're a refugee, but really they're not. So this is why they're more cautious with other Sudanese and other Darfuris who are not in that particular group from Jordan.
Another question? Can you use the microphone?
Morocco killed the dream of African and Darfurian because the settlement of Darfurian or in Morocco only, not in Europe or Canada. Does also Jordan likes Morocco system or Morocco policy?
I don't think so. I mean, I haven't heard of outright violence towards the Darfuris. I mean, obviously from the host community and other communities there are, but I haven't heard anything from the governments. So no.
The government, the UNHCR, give them the chance to go to Europe or Canada or anywhere else?
I do know friends that have been resettled recently. I had a family friend who I met in Jordan. He was just resettled to Canada, so I think it's still happening. It's just much slower, especially with the U.S. immigration policies being much stricter now, because many of the people that I had known who were resettled to the United States, but now, unfortunately, with the current political climate, that is not happening.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Yes.
First, thank you for your lecture. You just mentioned that climate change also has some effects on the problem, and I just want to know more about how does it affect the whole situation. Thank you.
Right. So okay, to put this in like a nutshell, there are different types of tribes and animals that they have. There are people who have cows. There are people who have camels. And these animals need different types of food and other ways to live. And because of drought and famine, certain tribes were then encroaching on other people's lands. And it wasn't just a political situation, it was almost caused by climate change. So then these tribes who are maybe in a different region bring their animals to another region. Maybe one tribe is Arab, one tribe is African, and then this causes ethnic tension. But the actual root source of it is climate change because of the changing topography and agrarian lifestyle within Darfur.
Okay, are there any last comments or questions? Okay, if there are none, thank you so much, Elena. I'd like to announce our next seminar will be on November 1st. It's entitled Migration Demography, German Nationalism Between Human Capital Requirements and Racist Exclusion by a speaker called Susan Schultz from Goethe University, Frankfurt. Thank you so much.